Hi everyone, this is Nia and today I'll be painting balls of yarn. This was a request by someone from the comments. I thought it was quite random, especially when I don't knit, but I've never painted them before and I wanted to give it a go to see how I would tackle and break down the subject. So let's just get right into it. I'm going to start by sketching out a rough composition. I'm just drawing out circles, trying to figure out the placement that I like. I'm quite happy with the variation in size and the placement, so I'm just going to clean out the lines. I felt like if I just painted balls of yarns, it'll be kind of boring unless I make a super colorful and fun doodle out of it. So for this one, I decided to add other elements to make the composition a little bit more interesting. So I'll be adding knitting needles. I made sure to use a ruler here because it's hard to get it accurate when I'm painting thin objects. And I'm also going to add other elements like loose yarn, small buttons, as well as a small spool of thread. And that's pretty much it for my simple composition. Next, I'm going to go over the colors I'll be using. This is Buff Titanium by Daniel Smith, Yellow Ochre by Holbein, Terre Verte by Holbein, Graphite Grey by Daniel Smith, Sepia by Holbein, Quin Sienna by Daniel Smith, Quin Red by Daniel Smith, and Prussian Blue by Holbein. Let's begin to paint. I'm going to start out by painting the knitting needles. For this, I used a mix of yellow ochre with a touch of Quin Sienna, just to darken it slightly, but if you want a lighter wood or darker wood, you can always adjust the color and the ratio. I want the material of the spool to be wooden, so I decided to use the same mixture. Next, I'm going to be painting the base color of the buttons. For this, I used a mix of Quin Sienna with Sepia, and this will just create a mid-tone brown. For the last small button, I decided to use a darker brown, so I added more sepia in the mix. Now that I have the base color of those additional elements, I'm going to start painting the base for the yarn. For the first one, I want to create a muted pink color. For this, I used a mix of Buff Titanium, Quin Red, and a little bit of Yellow Ochre. Even though I'm only painting the base color, I want to add the dimensions straight away. So while the surface is still wet, I used a thicker version of the color, and I even added a little bit more Quin Red to darken the color slightly and make it a bit more saturated. For the shadow, I decided to paint it on the bottom left, so the light is coming from the top right. I want the second ball of yarn to be a light warm gray color, so for this I used a mix of Buff Titanium with a tiny bit of sepia. Again, just like the previous yarn, I'm going to add additional dark colors on the bottom left while the surface is still wet, and for the darker color, I added a bit more sepia in the mix. For the last one, I knew I wanted to be a brown color, but I wasn't sure what tone, so I just tried to experiment with the color mixing. I mixed Quin Red with sepia, yellow ochre, and a bit of graphite gray. I'm going to treat this the same way as the other balls of yarn. While the surface is still damp, I add in a thicker version of this color. As you guys know, when watercolor dries, it will fade slightly and lighten in color. So here I'm just going to add on the darker shadows for all of the yarn balls. At this point, the brown yarn was a bit too wet still, so I decided to dry everything off completely before adding on the second layer. For the base color of the thread, I want to introduce a different hue to make it a little bit more colorful since we've been using neutrals. And for the thread, I used Terre Verte. Next, I'm going to create the form of the knitting needle. For this, I'm going to create a darker version of the base color. So I use a mix of yellow ochre, Quin Sienna, and a little bit of sepia to darken it slightly. I'm starting with the top of the needle here, and because they're circular, I basically added the shadows at the same place as the yarn balls. And I also switched to my small brush for this to make it much easier for me to fill in the colors in those tiny areas. As for the needles themselves, I want the darker part to be mostly underneath the needle, but since I want the light to also come from the top, I'm going to make the middle much lighter compared to the rest. So here I'm just basically outlining the needle using the darker color, and then I use a clean damp brush to soften the edges while leaving the middle portion with the lightest base color. After adding on the darker colors for the needle, the top now looks a little bit too light, so I'm just going to go over it again with the same color in a fairly thick consistency just to outline it, and then I'm going to soften the edges and pull some of the paint inwards while leaving a portion of the top right as the lightest area. Onto the details of the yarn, I'm going to first work on the largest yarn ball. I'm going to use the same mix as the base color for this one, so that's from buff titanium and sepia. I'm using a medium consistency with my small brush to paint on the strands one by one. I started with the strand which goes over the needle just to make sure I made use of the space well, and after that I'm just going to keep adding more loops underneath the ones I've already placed to start to create a bit of layering. To make the edges look a bit more convincing, every time I draw on the yarn strand, I made sure to finish off the ends with curved lines to give a bit of body to the yarn instead of it looking flat. I know that by adding the extra curves, I'm going to leave out some white space around the edges, but that's okay because we can always color it in and go over it later when I'm painting on the details. After I made a few loops and strands which covers the area pretty well, I'm going to go back in with the same color mixture, and I'm painting this on the areas where I haven't painted the yarn yet. This is just to give a bit more depth to the layering, and I'm darkening the color more on the bottom left side compared to the top right hand side by using more sepia in the ratio. Once I'm done, I'm going to dry everything off before adding more of the yarn strands. Before I painted this, I didn't do too much research on it, so I'm just making my strands quite random, but you can look at references to make your balls of yarn a little bit neater and following the pattern that it has when you buy them new. So here, as you can see, instead of following the pattern, I'm just trying to paint more strands underneath the ones that I've already painted to slowly build the layers and fill in the space. Sometimes I like to also go over some of the lines that I've already painted and darken certain areas, and the difference in the lines will help create a little bit more depth and form to each strand. Once I've covered all the space, I'm going to go back over some of the lines again and also separate some of the layering by smudging more paint around the edges of that area. And lastly, I'm going to add the yarn texture using the same color mixture in a light to medium consistency, and this will just help give more of a cylindrical form to each of the strand. This is optional though. I think it will still look nice without these additional textures. In fact, I feel like the material will look a bit more fluffy and soft, but since this is my first time painting yarns, I just wanted to experiment for myself and see how the textures look in this composition. I feel like I have a pretty good amount of detail here, so I'm going to leave this one. And before I move on to the next ball of yarn, I'm going to paint on the wooden spool. For this, I use the same mix as the knitting needle, which is from a mix of yellow ochre, Quin Sienna, and sepia. And for the bottom left side, I used a bit more sepia in the mix, and then I just soften everything to create a nice blend. After that, I use a mix of Terre Verte with a little bit of yellow ochre to make it a bit more yellow-green. And I'm just going to somewhat use a similar method to paint the threads as how I painted the strands of the yarn. After that, I'm going to make sure everything's completely dry before I add on the darker colors. And as for this darker tone, I use the same color mixture with added sepia. Now I'm going to move on to the second ball of yarn. For this, I used a mix of Quin Red, yellow ochre, and a little bit of sepia. I'm going to start out by painting a few strands again, just like before. And this time, as you can see, I'm using my large brush because I just find that it's a bit easier since this brush holds a bit more load and I can keep painting using the tip without having to reload my brush every so often. If it's harder for you to do it this way though, you can always use your smaller brush, so it's a bit easier to get cleaner thin lines. For the loose strand, I'm using a medium consistency of this. I don't want it as dark as the lines that I'm creating for the outlines because I'm going to go over them again and build on the color later. You might notice that I'm making a lot more strands in this one. That's because I'm trying a different technique. I'm just going to cover the whole thing with strands as I layer one by one. And once I cover the whole area, I'm going to go back in to add the shadows as well as define some of the lines to create the different line weights and add the texture. As I'm painting on the strands, I'm still going to paint on the round edges. And I'm going to keep doing this until I cover the whole area. Once I cover everything, now I'm going to start smudging and adding shadows to the layers underneath. And to do this, I use a very thin consistency on my brush and I just add extra water to soften the blend. The idea is more or less the same, but this time I've just drawn out all the strands. But I just look at the layers and paint on shadows underneath certain groups of strands. Just like the first yarn though, I'm trying to add more shadows on the bottom left corner. At the same time, I'm also going to go over some of the lines and vary the line weight. For this, I like to use my small brush so I can darken the very small areas. Once I'm happy with the amount of shadows and form, I'm going to add on the texture, and because the strands are smaller this time, I made sure to use a very light load on my brush so the detail doesn't puddle up. After I have a good distribution of texture, I'm going to work on the darkest value. For this, I used the same mix with added sepia, and I also used a very thick consistency. I lined the bottom left corner, and I also lined one side of the loose strand. I'm going to do the same thing for the last one, but I want this one to have thinner strands, so I just place the outlines closer together. Because the lines are closer together, the stroke needs to be thinner as well. So this is why I'm going to switch to my liner brush to make it a bit easier to create longer, thinner lines. Because each strand is thinner, there are going to be more lines that I'm painting for this one, and this is when I also realized that it's getting a bit messy. This is why I think it's ideal to follow the actual pattern of the yarn, but it was too late already, so I'm just going to continue on. For this one, I added a hole in the middle by just filling it in with the same color, and just like the other yarn, I'm going to add on shadows to make the layers a bit more distinctive, with the darkest value being on the bottom left side. There's already a lot going on here, so I don't really want to overdo it with textures. So now I'm going to paint the details for the buttons. For this first one, I just use a thick consistency of sepia. I'm just going to follow the same design for all the buttons. As for this next one, I use a mix of sepia and Quin Sienna. For the holes, I'm just going to use sepia in a thick consistency, and I'm going to create the same design for the last button using the same colors. I think I'm fairly happy with all the elements that I've painted, but I do feel like it needs a little bit of cast shadow because it looks like the items are floating. So for the cast shadow, I used a mix of Graphite Grey, Prussian Blue with a tiny bit of Quin Red. I used a medium consistency to paint the center of the yarn, and then I used a thinner consistency to paint the cast shadows under the buttons as well as on the bottom left side of the yarn. Then of course I'm going to follow this up using a clean damp brush to create a softer transition. While the surface of the cast shadow is still a bit damp, I'm going to dot in a slightly thicker consistency so there's more of a contrast from light to dark. I'm also going to add a light cast shadow on the loose yarn as well as the thread. Lastly, I'm going to paint on the cast shadow for the knitting needles. For this, because it's slightly raised and the needles are not directly on top of the surface, I left out a little bit of space between the needle and the cast shadow. So that's pretty much it for this painting. It was definitely an interesting subject matter, and I hope you guys enjoyed it as well. Like usual, all the list of tools as well as my social media links will be in my description box. If you guys are still here, thank you so much for watching till the end, and I'll see you at the next one. Bye!